If you walked through the streets of Manhattan in the middle of the 1980s, you would have felt a strange vibration in the air. It was not just the noise of the traffic or the energy of Wall Street. It was the feeling of an empire looking over its shoulder and seeing a new challenger approaching fast. For the first time in a century, the United States of America was afraid. It was not afraid of Soviet nuclear missiles or communist ideology. It was afraid of VCRs. It was afraid of Walkmans. It was afraid of compact cars that never seemed to break down. The challenger was Japan, and to the average American, it seemed like Japan was buying the entire world. The symbols of this takeover were everywhere. In 1989, the Mitsubishi Estate Company bought a controlling interest in Rockefeller Center. It was a purchase that sent shockwaves through the American psyche. Rockefeller Center was not just an office complex. It was a monument to American capitalism. It was the home of the national Christmas tree. And now it belonged to Tokyo. Then came the news that Sony had purchased Columbia Pictures. One of the great Hollywood studios, the Dream Factory of America, was now a subsidiary of a Japanese electronics giant. Turn on the television in 1985 and you would see images of American frustration. You would see auto workers in Detroit taking sledgehammers to Toyota Corollas in the parking lots of closed factories. You would hear politicians in Washington warning that Silicon Valley was going to become a colony of the Japanese tech industry. The deficit between what America bought from Japan and what America sold to Japan was widening every single day. The cover of Time magazine asked a simple, terrifying question. Japan, Inc., can anyone stop it? To understand how we got to the hotel room that changed history, we have to understand the economic machine that Japan built from the ashes of World War II. It was a miracle of planning and discipline. After the war, Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were burned. Its industry was obliterated. But the Japanese bureaucrats in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, devised a strategy that was elegant in its simplicity. They would not try to rebuild everything at once. They would focus on exports. They would make things that the world wanted, and they would sell them cheaper and better than anyone else. They started with cheap textiles and toys. Then they moved to steel, then ships, then automobiles, then electronics. By the 1980s, Japan had perfected a system of high-quality manufacturing that the world had never seen. They used methods like just-in-time production and Kaizen, which means continuous improvement. While American factories were loud, dirty, and inefficient, Japanese factories were quiet, clean, and precise. But there was a secret weapon in the Japanese arsenal that had nothing to do with efficiency. It was the currency, the Japanese yen. For decades, the value of the yen had been kept artificially low against the US dollar. A cheap yen meant that Japanese goods were incredibly cheap for Americans to buy. If a Toyota cost 2 million yen to build and the exchange rate was 300 yen to the dollar, that car cost only around $6,000 in the United States. An American Ford built for the same cost might sell for $10,000. The math was impossible to beat. This currency advantage allowed Japanese companies to capture market share and destroy their competition. They hollowed out the American manufacturing base. The Rust Belt of America, where steel mills and car factories stood empty, was a direct casualty of this currency imbalance. By 1985, the situation in Washington had reached a boiling point. The president was Ronald Reagan. He was a free trade conservative. He believed in open markets. But the political pressure from the Democrats and the unions was becoming unbearable. Congress was drafting protectionist bills that would slap massive tariffs on Japanese goods. They wanted to build a wall around the American economy. Reagan knew that a trade war would be a disaster. It could lead to a global depression. He needed a different solution. Enter James Baker. He was Reagan's chief of staff, and in 1985 he became the Secretary of the Treasury. James Baker was a master tactician. He was a man who understood power. He looked at the problem and realized that trying to stop Americans from buying Japanese cars was a losing battle. The American consumer loved Japanese cars. The problem wasn't the quality of the goods. The problem was the price of the money. The US dollar was too strong. Under the chairmanship of Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve, interest rates in America had been pushed sky high to kill inflation. High interest rates attract money. Investors from all over the world poured their money into dollars to get those high returns. This demand made the dollar incredibly expensive. A strong dollar was great for American tourists traveling to Paris or Rome, but it was death for American factories trying to sell bulldozers or airplanes abroad. Baker hatched a plan. It was a plan that required secrecy and absolute coordination. He needed to devalue the US dollar. He needed to make the dollar cheaper and the Japanese yen and the German mark more expensive. If he could do that, American goods would become competitive again and the trade deficit would shrink. But the United States could not do this alone. If America just started printing money to lower the value of the dollar, the markets would panic. It had to be a coordinated intervention. He needed the other major economic powers to agree. He needed Great Britain. He needed France. He needed West Germany. And most importantly, he needed Japan. The invitation went out in secret. The finance ministers and central bank governors of the G5 nations were invited to a meeting in New York City on September 22nd, 1985. They were told to keep it off their official schedules. They were told to avoid the press. The location was the Plaza Hotel. The Plaza was a symbol of old-world luxury, sitting right at the corner of Central Park. It was a place of chandeliers and thick carpets and discreet service. It was the perfect place for a conspiracy. On that Sunday morning, the Japanese delegation arrived. They were led by Noboru Takeshita, the finance minister of Japan. Takeshita was a powerful man in the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. He was known as a deal-maker. He arrived at the plaza knowing exactly what the Americans wanted. He knew they were going to ask Japan to strengthen the yen. You might ask why Japan would ever agree to this. Why would they agree to sabotage their own export machine? Why would they agree to make their Toyotas and Sonys more expensive for Americans? The answer is fear. Takeshita and the Japanese government were terrified of the protectionist anger in the U.S. Congress. They believed that if they did not give James Baker what he wanted, the United States would close its borders. They thought that a stronger yen was a price worth paying to keep the American market open. They also had a sense of hubris. They believed that Japanese companies were so efficient and so powerful that they could survive a currency shift. They thought they were invincible. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense but polite. James Baker laid out the American position. The trade imbalances were unsustainable. The dollar was dangerously high. The protectionist forces in Congress were ready to strike. The solution was a coordinated sale of dollars by all the central banks. They would flood the market with dollars, driving the price down, and they would buy yen and marks, driving the price up. The Germans were skeptical. They worried about inflation. The British and French were supportive but cautious. But the Japanese were compliant. Takeshita reportedly said that a 10 to 20% appreciation of the yen would be acceptable. He wanted to show that Japan was a responsible global citizen. He wanted Japan to be seen as a full partner in the world order, not just an economic predator. The meeting lasted for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Americans held the ultimate card. They were the security umbrella for Europe and Japan against the Soviet Union. They were the consumer of last resort for the world economy. When the giant speaks, the others listen. They drafted a communiqué. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. It did not explicitly say, "We're going to crash the dollar." It said that exchange rates should better reflect fundamental economic conditions. It said that orderly appreciation of the main non-dollar currencies against the dollar is desirable. It was vague to the untrained eye, but to the currency traders of the world, it was a declaration of war on the status quo. On Monday morning, September 23rd, the announcement hit the news wires. The reaction was immediate and violent. As the markets opened in Tokyo, London, and New York, traders panicked. They sold dollars and bought yen. The value of the dollar began to plummet. The Plaza Accord was in effect. In the first 24 hours, the plan worked perfectly. The dollar fell significantly against the yen. James Baker was hailed as a genius. He had engineered a soft landing for the dollar without causing a market crash. The politicians in Washington celebrated. The pressure for tariffs evaporated. It seemed like a triumph of international cooperation. But in Tokyo, the mood was very different. As the yen climbed higher and higher, panic began to set in among the corporate titans of Japan. They called it indaka, high yen. Imagine you were the CEO of a Japanese camera company. Yesterday, you sold a camera in New York for $100, and you brought back 25,000 yen to pay your workers and your suppliers. Today, you sell the same camera for $100, but you only bring back 15,000 yen. Your profit margin has vanished. You're losing money on every single sale. This was the reality of indaka. The yen did not just appreciate by 10 or 20%, as Takeshita had hoped. It kept going and going and going. In 1985, $1 bought 240 yen. By 1986, it bought 150 yen. By 1987, it was approaching 120 yen. The value of the Japanese currency had doubled in less than 2 years. Japanese exports were being strangled. Factories in Osaka and Nagoya began to close. Unemployment, which had been almost non-existent in Japan, began to tick up. The screams from the business community reached the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan. Do something. Save us. The Americans have tricked us. We are bleeding to death. The Bank of Japan was trapped. They could not intervene to stop the yen from rising because they had signed the Plaza Accord. They had promised the world they would let the yen rise. If they reneged on the deal, they risked the wrath of the United States, so they looked for another lever to pull. If they could not lower the currency, they decided they would lower the cost of money itself. They decided to slash interest rates. They decided to flood the Japanese economy with cheap cash to help companies survive the shock of the high yen. This decision, made in a moment of panic and pressure, was the seed of the destruction that was to come. It was the decision that turned a currency crisis into a mania. It was the decision that created the bubble. As we end the first part of this story, we leave Japan in a state of transformation. The Plaza Accord has been signed. The dollar has crashed. The yen has skyrocketed. The Japanese export machine is sputtering. To save the economy, the central bank is opening the floodgates of liquidity. Money is becoming free. And that free money is looking for a home. It is not going into factories or research. It is going into land. It is going into stocks. It is going into golf club memberships. The stage is set for the greatest financial party in the history of the world and the devastating hangover that will follow. The year is 1986, and the Bank of Japan has opened the floodgates. In a desperate attempt to offset the pain of the rising yen caused by the Plaza Accord, they slashed the official discount rate from 5% down to 2.5%. They kept it there for over 2 years. In the world of central banking, this is the equivalent of pouring gasoline on a fire. The intention was to help struggling exporters like Toyota and Sony invest in new machinery and stay competitive. But that is not what happened. Japanese companies, realizing that their exports were no longer as profitable because of the strong yen, started to look for other ways to make money. They looked at their balance sheets and realized that with interest rates so low, they could borrow money for almost nothing. This was the era of Zaytech, or financial engineering. Big corporations stopped focusing on making better radios and cars and started acting like hedge funds. They borrowed cheap money and poured it into the stock market. They poured it into real estate. And because everyone was doing it at the same time, prices began to rise. And as prices rose, the collateral value of their assets rose, allowing them to borrow even more money to buy even more assets. It was a self-reinforcing loop of insanity. The Tokyo Stock Exchange became a rocket ship. The Nikkei index, which stood around 13,000 in 1985, began a vertical climb that would take it to nearly 39,000 by the end of 1989. The total value of all the companies on the Tokyo Stock Exchange was greater than all the companies in the United States combined. But the real madness was in the land. Japan is a small, mountainous country with very little flat land. Land has always been valuable, but in the late 80s, it became priceless. The stories from this era sound like myths, but they are matters of record. At the height of the bubble, a theoretical calculation suggested that the land under the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo, a plot of roughly 1.3 square miles, was worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. Think about that. One park in Tokyo was worth more than Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, the vineyards of Napa, and the beaches of Malibu combined. A simple 3-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood of Tokyo could cost $10 million. Golf club memberships became tradable assets. To join the most exclusive clubs cost $2 or $3 million. There was even a market for futures contracts on golf club memberships. People were speculating on the future price of the right to play golf. The corporate culture of Japan transformed. The frugality and discipline of the post-war years evaporated. It was the age of the expense account. Businessmen would go out for dinner and spend $10,000 on sushi and sake sprinkled with gold leaf. Then they would take taxis home to the suburbs, but you couldn't just hail a taxi. There were so many people trying to get rides that people would stand on the curb waving 10,000 yen notes, roughly $100, just to get a driver to stop. Japanese companies, flush with this bubble cash, went on a global shopping spree. This was when they bought the Pebble Beach golf course in California. They bought Van Gogh's Sunflowers painting for $40 million, a record at the time. They bought Tiffany buildings. They bought ski resorts. To the outside world, it looked like Japan had won the economic game. It looked like the 21st century would be the Japanese century. But inside the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance, there were a few men who watched this spectacle with growing horror. They knew it was fake. They knew that an economy cannot be built on rising land prices alone. They knew that the underlying productivity of the nation was being ignored in favor of speculation. They called it the bubble economy. The man who would eventually pop the bubble was Yasushi Mino. He was a career central banker, known for his stern demeanor and his belief in stability. He was known as the inflation fighter. For years, he had watched his predecessors keep interest rates too low bowing to political pressure and the demands of the Plaza Accord. In December 1989, Miyano took over as the governor of the Bank of Japan. His first words to the press were a declaration of war on the bubble. He said that the rising land prices were creating a gap between the rich and the poor that threatened the social fabric of Japan. He said that the economy was overheating. He was going to take away the punch bowl. On December 25, 1989, just days after taking office, Miyano raised interest rates. The market shrugged it off. They thought it was a small correction. But Miyano was not done. He raised rates again and again. He raised the discount rate up to 6%. He also issued a directive to the banks to limit the total amount of money they could lend for real estate. He choked off the supply of credit. The effect was not immediate. Bubbles have momentum. But as the cost of borrowing rose, the speculative fever broke. The first crack appeared in the stock market. On the first trading day of 1990, the Nikkei index fell. Then it fell again. Investors who had borrowed money to buy stocks suddenly faced margin calls. They had to sell to pay their debts. This selling triggered more selling. By August 1990, the stock market had lost nearly half its value. The wealth that had been created on paper over 5 years evaporated in 5 months. But the real disaster was the land. Real estate is not like stocks. You cannot sell a building in a second on a computer screen. Real estate is illiquid. As interest rates rose, the developers who had borrowed billions to build office towers found they could not pay the interest. They tried to sell the buildings, but there were no buyers because the banks had stopped lending. Prices began to slide. Then they plummeted. The land under the Imperial Palace was no longer worth California. In some commercial districts of Tokyo, real estate prices fell by 80%. This crash revealed the rot at the heart of the banking system. Japanese banks had lent trillions of yen backed by land as collateral. When the value of that land collapsed, the loans went bad. The banks were technically insolvent. They were sitting on mountains of bad debt that they refused to acknowledge. In a normal capitalist system, these banks would have gone bankrupt. But the Japanese government, fearing a total social collapse, decided to keep them alive on life support. They allowed the banks to pretend that the bad loans were still good. This created the zombie banks. These were banks that were alive on paper, but dead in reality. Because they had no real capital, they couldn't lend to new businesses. They couldn't fund new startups. They just sat there, collecting what little interest they could to pay for their own existence. This was the beginning of the lost decades. While the United States in the 1990s was experiencing the boom of the internet and the information age, Japan was stuck in the mud. The economy did not grow. Wages did not rise. Prices actually began to fall, leading to a deflationary spiral. When prices fall, people stop spending because they think things will be cheaper tomorrow. This stops companies from investing, which leads to lower wages, which leads to even less spending. It is a death spiral for an economy. The generation of young people entering the workforce in the 1990s and 2000s became known as the lost generation. They couldn't find permanent jobs because companies weren't hiring. They worked part-time contracts. They lived with their parents. They stopped getting married and having children, accelerating Japan's demographic crisis. The Plaza Accord was the first domino in this chain of events. It is a perfect example of the law of unintended consequences. The U.S. intended to fix a trade deficit. They ended up breaking their rival. Japan intended to save its exporters. They ended up destroying their financial system. There's a debate among historians and economists about whether this was a calculated assassination. Did the United States know that forcing the yen up would lead to this disaster? Most evidence suggests that James Baker and the U.S. team were not trying to destroy Japan. They were simply looking out for American interests. They were pragmatic politicians solving a political problem at home. They did not force the Bank of Japan to slash interest rates to 2.5%. That was a Japanese mistake. They did not force Japanese corporations to buy golf courses for millions of dollars. That was Japanese greed. However, from the perspective of Tokyo, the Plaza Accord looks like a trap. It looks like the moment when the hegemon changed the rules of the game just as the challenger was winning. The United States used its diplomatic and military leverage to force an economic adjustment that Japan was not ready to handle. The legacy of the Plaza Accord is visible everywhere in the world today. It taught China a very valuable lesson. Chinese leaders studied the Japanese collapse meticulously. They vowed never to let the United States force them to appreciate their currency. For decades, China kept the yuan artificially low, resisting American pressure, citing the Plaza Accord as the cautionary tale. They refused to float their currency freely because they saw what happened to Japan. For Japan, the scars are still there. The Nikkei index finally recovered to its 1989 peak in 2024, 35 years later. Think about that. If you had bought stocks in Japan at the peak of the bubble, you would have waited 35 years just to break even. The relationship between the US and Japan changed permanently. Japan ceased to be a terrifying economic rival. The fear of a Japanese planet vanished. Japan became a loyal, stagnant ally, a rich country with a comfortable standard of living, but without the dynamism or the threat of global dominance. The Plaza Hotel still stands in New York. It is still a place of luxury, but the agreement signed in its white and gold room serves as a monument to a different kind of power. It proves that you don't need bombs to destroy an economy. You just need a signature on a piece of paper and the arrogance to believe that you can control the tides of the market without drowning. The economic assassination of Japan was not a murder in the traditional sense. It was an assisted suicide. The US handed Japan the rope in the form of a strong yen, and Japan, in a panic, used it to hang itself with a bubble of its own making. And the world watched as the rising sun stopped rising and simply hung in the sky, casting a long shadow over the future of the global economy. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.